This is the joint China-Saudi announcement that just threatened of American financial power. For the United States has enjoyed a privilege in history has ever had. A barrel of oil sold anywhere in purchased in US dollars. If you were in Europe, Asia, Africa, or if you wanted oil, you needed this system called the Petrodollar. America an extraordinary advantage. The entire world had to hold dollars. It meant global demand for U.S. currency was guaranteed. It meant America could print money and export inflation to the rest of the planet. It was the foundation of American economic dominance. But this morning, Monday, February 3rd, 2026, that foundation just cracked. Breaking news out of Riyadh and Beijing has confirmed what energy analysts have been whispering about for months. Saudi Arabia, the largest oil exporter in the world and America's most important ally in the Middle East for half a century, has officially agreed to accept Chinese yuan as payment for oil sales to China, not as an option, not as a trial, as official policy. The Saudi Energy Ministry and the China National Petroleum Corporation just signed agreements that will allow billions of dollars worth of oil to be traded in yuan instead of dollars. This is not symbolic, this is not theoretical, this is the beginning of the end of the petrodollar system. And if the petrodollar dies, the US dollar's role as the global reserve currency dies with it. And if the dollar loses reserve status, America loses the ability to run massive deficits, fund the military, and maintain its standard of living. We are watching the unraveling of American financial hegemony in real time. And most Americans have no idea it is happening. In this emergency geopolitical breakdown, we are going to expose exactly what the petrodollar system is and why it has been the secret source of American wealth for 50 years. We are going to show you the timeline of how Saudi Arabia went from America's most loyal partner to accepting yuan from China. We are going to explain why this matters more than any other economic story this year. We are going to reveal what happens to the US dollar, to your savings, to inflation, and to American power when oil is no longer exclusively traded in dollars. And we are going to answer the question that nobody in Washington wants to ask. Can America survive without the petrodollar? The deal that kept America rich for half a century just expired, and the consequences are going to be catastrophic. To understand why this Saudi-China oil deal is so dangerous, we have to understand what the petrodollar system actually is and how it came to exist. Most Americans have never heard the term petrodollar, but it is the invisible pillar holding up the entire American economy. Here is the history. In 1971, President Richard Nixon did something that changed the world. He ended the Bretton Woods system. For decades after World War II, the US dollar was backed by gold. Foreign governments could exchange dollars for gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This gave the dollar credibility. But by the early 1970s, the US was printing so much money to fund the Vietnam War and domestic spending that foreign governments started demanding gold. The US gold reserves were being depleted, so Nixon closed the gold window. He ended the convertibility of dollars to gold. The dollar became a fiat currency backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the US government. This created a crisis. Why would the world continue to use dollars if they were not backed by gold? The dollar could collapse, inflation could explode. The global monetary system was on the brink. The Nixon administration needed a plan to make the world keep using dollars, and they found one: oil. In 1974, after the Arab oil embargo and the oil price shocks, the United States made a deal with Saudi Arabia. The details of the agreement were secret for decades, but here is what we know. The U.S. promised to provide military protection to Saudi Arabia. America would sell them advanced weapons. America would defend the Saudi royal family from external threats and internal uprisings. In exchange, Saudi Arabia agreed to two things. First, they would sell oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. Second, they would invest their surplus oil revenues, their petrodollars, in U.S. Treasury bonds. This was genius. It meant that every country in the world that wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, the largest exporter, had to first obtain U.S. dollars. This created permanent global demand for the dollar. Even if a country did not trade with the United States, it still needed dollars to buy energy. The dollar became the global reserve currency not because of gold, but because of oil. But if oil can be bought in yuan, countries do not need to hold as many dollars. Central banks around the world will start diversifying their reserves. They will hold more yuan, more euros, more gold, and fewer dollars. And when central banks sell dollars, the value of the dollar falls. Here is the doom loop. Saudi Arabia accepts yuan for oil. Other oil producers follow. Countries reduce dollar reserves, demand for dollars falls, the dollar weakens, U.S. imports become more expensive, inflation rises in the U.S., the Federal Reserve has to raise interest rates to defend the dollar, higher rates slow the economy, recession runs bigger deficits to economy, but nobody buys U.S. Treasury bonds anymore. The dollar is losing value. To print money to buy the bonds itself is more inflation. The currency deficit accelerates. Theoretical. This is what happened to the in the 20th century. Britain superpower. The pound was currency. But after Britain was broke, the pound status, and Britain went from to middle power in a generation. The same thing could happen to the and American power. Now let's talk about what this means. If the dollar loses reserve, savings lose value. If you have a bank account, it buys less. If you have it buys less. If you have funds or a 401k investment denominated assets, the declines. Inflation eats your. But it is not just about your personal. The entire U.S. economy is built on. Americans buy goods made in China, Mexico. Those goods are. A strong dollar makes foreign currency. If the dollar weakens, those imports, the cost of everything goes up. Clothing, electronics. The American standard of living is. Take away the petrodollar and collapses. The other consequence is debt. The U.S. government has $35 trillion in debt. That debt is denominated in dollars. Right now, the government can borrow cheaply because the world needs dollars and buys treasury bonds. But if the petrodollar dies, foreign demand for treasuries collapses. Interest rates on U.S. debt go up, the government has to spend more on interest payments and less on everything else. Or the Federal Reserve prints money to buy the bonds, which causes inflation. Either way, the fiscal situation becomes unsustainable. Let's talk about the geopolitical angle. The petrodollar was not just about economics. It was about power. The fact that the world needed dollars to buy oil gave the United States leverage. If a country did something the U.S. did not like, the U.S. could cut that country off from the dollar financial system. Sanctions only work because everyone needs dollars. Iran, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela, they have all been hit with dollar-based sanctions. And those sanctions hurt because being excluded from the dollar system means you cannot buy oil, you cannot trade internationally, you are isolated. But if oil can be bought in Yuan, sanctions lose their teeth. Russia can sell oil to China for Yuan. Iran can sell oil to China for Yuan. Countries that are sanctioned by the U.S. can bypass the dollar system entirely. American financial power, the ability to enforce its will through economic coercion, evaporates. This is why the Saudi-China deal is so threatening to Washington. It is not just about money, it is about the collapse of American hegemony. For 50 years, the U.S. has been able to run the world because the world needed the dollar. If the world does not need the dollar anymore, the U.S. cannot run the world anymore. Now let's examine why Saudi Arabia is doing this. For decades, Saudi Arabia was America's most loyal ally in the Middle East. The U.S. protected Saudi Arabia from Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War. The U.S. sold Saudi Arabia hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons. The relationship was ironclad. So why is Saudi Arabia now willing to betray that relationship by accepting Yuan? Several reasons. First, Saudi Arabia is angry at the United States. The Biden administration has been critical of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. The U.S. blamed MBS for the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The U.S. has pressured Saudi Arabia on human rights. The U.S. has been reluctant to sell certain advanced weapons to the Saudis. From the Saudi perspective, the U.S. is not a reliable partner anymore. Here is how the system worked. Let's say Japan wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia. Japan does not use dollars domestically. It uses yen. Go to the foreign exchange market and sell yen to buy. Then Japan uses those dollars to buy. Saudi Arabia receives dollars, takes those dollars and buys U.S. Treasury, funds the U.S. government deficit. The dollars flow back to America. Petrodollar recycling system is extraordinary. The United States massive trade deficits and without consequence. Normally, big deficits, its currency collapses and soars, but not the because the world needed demand for the dollar. No matter how much America printed, it could import more than it exported, more than it collected in taxes, and inflation was exported to the rest. The petrodollar gave a lunch that lasted 50 years. The system only works if oil is dollars. If countries can buy currencies, they do not need to hold dollars. And if they do not need dollars, demand falls. And if demand for the value of the dollar falls, inflation explodes. And if inflation, the U.S. standard of living collapses. This is why the Saudi-China is so dangerous. It breaks the monopoly on oil. So what exactly Arabia and China agree to? The slowly, but here are official statements and energy industry sources. China is the largest importer of oil in the world. They import more oil than the United States. And Saudi Arabia is one of China's biggest suppliers. For years, this trade was conducted entirely in US dollars. China would sell goods to the world, accumulate dollars, and use those dollars to buy Saudi oil. But over the last 5 years, China and Saudi Arabia have been negotiating an alternative. China wants to pay for oil in yuan. Saudi Arabia was reluctant at first. The yuan is not a fully convertible global currency like the dollar. But China offered incentives. They offered to buy more Saudi oil. They offered infrastructure investments in Saudi Arabia. They offered military cooperation. And critically, China set up financial infrastructure to make yuan payments feasible. In 2018, China launched the Shanghai International Energy Exchange. This is a futures market where oil can be traded in yuan. China also created the Petro-Yuan system, a network of banks and clearing houses that can process yuan-denominated oil transactions. And China has been stockpiling gold to back the yuan, giving it credibility. The turning point came in 2022 and 2023. Relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia deteriorated. President Biden criticized Saudi Arabia over human rights and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. The U.S. pressured Saudi Arabia to increase oil production to lower global prices, which hurt Saudi revenues. Meanwhile, China was offering Saudi Arabia respect, investment, and an alternative to dollar dependency. The Saudis started to see the U.S. as unreliable and China as the future. In March 2023, China brokered a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This was a massive diplomatic coup. It showed that China, not the U.S., was now the power broker in the Middle East, and it signaled that Saudi Arabia was willing to work with China even on issues that contradicted U.S. interests. Then in late 2023 and into 2024, the first yuan-denominated oil transactions began. They were small at first, but they were real. Saudi Aramco, the state-owned oil company, accepted yuan for shipments to China. The transactions were settled through Chinese banks. The yuan was converted to other assets or used to buy Chinese goods. The system worked. Now in 2026, the arrangement is being formalized and expanded. The reports indicate that Saudi Arabia has agreed to accept yuan for a significant portion of its oil sales to China. Some estimates suggest 20 to 30% of Saudi-China oil trade will be in yuan within the next 2 years. And other OPEC countries are watching. If Saudi Arabia can do it, they can too. This is the beginning of the end of dollar exclusivity in the oil market. And once the exclusivity is gone, the entire petrodollar system unravels. Let's talk about what this means for the US dollar. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. About 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. About 90% of foreign exchange transactions involve the dollar. And until now, virtually 100% of oil transactions were in dollars. These three pillars prop up demand for the dollar.